Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Diane Mazarana, and I'm a research professor at the Fletcher School and research director at the Feinstein International Center, both at Tufts University in the United States. I'll be your moderator today for Children Born of Wartime Sexual Violence, Challenges, Insights, and Best Practices. We have over 240 people registered for the webinar today, so welcome to all of you. For over 20 years, I've been working with women and girls who have children born of war-related sexual violence. It's my commitment to these women and their children that brought me to join forces with the speakers here today, plus a dozen authors, to produce an international book entitled Challenging Conceptions: Children Born of Wartime Sexual Violence, published by Oxford University Press last year. Today's panelists will share contemporary research findings from our book and highlight best practices regarding the well-being of children born of wartime sexual violence, their mothers, fathers, and broader communities. A women's rights, survivor-centered approach is at the core of our book and panel discussion today, and it must be at the core of supporting survivors of sexual violence. A women's rights and survivor-centered approach is a guiding principle of the action of the grassroots and national groups focused on working with women and their children born of sexual violence and conflict. It's also a guiding principle of the call to action to ensure the rights and well-being of children born of sexual violence and conflict, and its sister document, the Platform for Action, promoting the rights and well-being of children born of conflict-related sexual violence. It's a core component of the Women, Peace, and Security agenda, and also the call to action on protection from gender-based violence in emergencies, the UN Secretary General's framework for addressing sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment, and UN Security Council Resolution 2467, and the subsequent Secretary General's report, Women and Girls Who Become Pregnant as a Result of Sexual Violence and Conflict, and Children Born of Sexual Violence and Conflict. Today, our panelists are survivors, researchers, scholars, practitioners, and advocates. We'll hear from them, and then we'll have reflections by Dr. Sima Samar, the former director for the Afghan Independent Human Rights Commission, and now a colleague of ours at the Fletcher School, and Letitia Anderson of the Office of the United Nations Special Representative of the Secretary General on Sexual Violence and Conflict. We'll ask our audience to put your questions and comments in the chat, and we'll address some of those questions in the latter part of our panel discussion. I would now like to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Kimberly Tyden, who is a professor at the Fletcher School at Tufts University. Dr. Tyden, the floor is yours.
First of all, I want to reiterate the thanks that Diane has just given and also welcome all of you today. Let me briefly then mention some of the themes that run throughout our book, Challenging Conceptions. One is the need to unpack the idea of stigma. We see that the concept of stigma is omnipresent in the literature on children born of war. More on that term in a moment. And stigma is given a tremendous and wide-ranging explanatory power. From an anthropological perspective, it's a thin explanation for a very thick phenomenon. Research requires nuanced concepts to produce nuanced and actionable findings. How old are these children? When they are discriminated against, why? And as we know, and as chapters in our book make clear, they're not always discriminated. These are also stories of love, compassion, and care. Is it that they pose an economic threat? Are people worried about inheritance and who gets a piece of land? If we know that, we can do something about the economic concerns. Is it religiously based rejection? If so, we would want to know that specificity to determine which religious actors we can work with and perhaps work around. Do the boys, as children, pose a greater threat than the girls? We would also want to understand the gendered dimensions of that. So it seems to us throughout the book that rather than just allowing stigma to be a placeholder in the literature, we want more nuanced research that allows us to understand finely grained contextual factors. Another theme that weaves throughout the book is the issue of life cycles, names, silences, and secrets. So when speaking about children born of war, exactly who are we referring to? Infants, children, adolescents, the elderly, With respect, children born of war is policy speak. And yet again, research categories demand much greater precision, and our authors, our contributors, offer that. In this book, when the authors refer to children born of conflict-related sexual violence, we're not speaking about the age of the person per se, but rather the violent circumstances of their conception and birth, and how those circumstances manifest across a lifetime. The needs of these people will change as they age, and attentiveness to those changes is important. We also found that life cycle is a producive analytic for other things. What are the intergenerational impacts of sexual violence? When children are given injurious names, can those change? When is kinship figured and reconfigured across time? So one of the important themes here is the absolute necessity for longitudinal studies to capture those changes, as several of the chapters in Challenging Conceptions make clear. Seminal violence need not be destiny. We also look at the importance of making kin, moving beyond patriarchal. I thought I was having a time limit. Patriarchal biologies. We want to think about local biologies and theories of transmission. There is a tendency for the rapist fathers to inform the life chances of these people, but they don't need to dictate those chances. We want to constantly challenge patriarchal reasoning. So frequently, there's the assumption that everything passes through the father's contribution, that moment of conception. We need more research to challenge that patriarchal reasoning and lineage and inheritance structure. We also need more research with men. This book offers some very important inroads into understanding the role of the fathers in the lives of these children. We also look in the seminar, in the book, at statecraft, and you're going to hear some rich discussions of when statecraft, documents, identification, and registration force disclosure in a way that is harmful rather than helpful. Finally, I will make my last pitch. I was reading the Platform for Action, Promoting the Rights and Well-Being of Children Born of Conflict-Related Sexual Violence. And once again, I understand, for those working within the Women, Peace, and Security architecture, I understand the conditional funding and silences. I think it's a feminist obligation for those of us working outside of that architecture to always insist on the rights of a full range of sexual and reproductive services for everyone. I quote from page 18 of that UN Platform for Action, with all due respect. Quote, women and girls who become pregnant as a result of conflict-related sexual violence and do not give birth to the children are beyond the scope of this platform, end quote. I understand that uttering the word abortion is a challenging thing in light of international politics and funding. But I would urge all of us who are able and willing to insist on disrupting this particular silence and to insist on including those women in our circle of compassion and concern. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Tyden. Our next speaker is Dipali Anumol. She will speak with us on contributions that she and her colleague have made regarding children born of sexual violence in the war in Rwanda. Ms. Amali, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Diane. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. I just want to start by saying that this is a difficult time and this is also a difficult matter. So if you need to step away, please do. The 1994 genocide in Rwanda occurred in a context of heightened ethnic divisions between the Hutu, Tutsi, and Twa groups. Rape and other forms of sexual violence was systematically and routinely used. The National Population Office of Rwanda states that between 2,000 to 5,000 children were born as a result of genocidal rape. However, underreporting due to shame and stigma lead experts to believe the actual estimate is between 10,000 and 25,000. The children born of wartime sexual violence and their mothers face a range of economic and social hardships such as poverty, unemployment, ill health, and illiteracy due to continued isolation and stigmatization. This isolation and lack of support from the state and community were primary drivers for the work undertaken by Survivors Fund and Foundation Rwanda. This presentation is based on work done along with my co-author, Samuel Munderere, who is the Chief Executive at SURF and the Program Director at Foundation Rwanda. Next slide, please. Trauma due to war, death, and violence have an adverse impact on a mother's ability to parent, her relationship with her children, and the psychological development of the child. With the help of psychologists, SURF designed a training program for mothers around parenting, disclosure, identity, and child rights. This empowered mothers to disclose details of their pregnancy and birth to their children. Samuel insists that the choice of disclosure of these circumstances belongs solely with the mothers. SURF created a network of community counseling groups across the country that allowed mothers a safe and confidential space to meet other mothers in similar situations and to discuss their own traumatic experiences. It also gave mothers space and time to consider how to improve their relationships with their children. Many of these mothers had never told anyone about their rapes before, so the groups gave mothers a chance to do this before disclosing the circumstances to their children. SURF and Foundation Rwanda also work with the children born of wartime rape who are now actually in their 20s. Here, they're provided with further education and vocational opportunities. They also participate in forums and support groups to discuss a wide range of issues such as trauma, family, relationships, sexual health, and careers. Practically, though, there's an issue of disclosure here. And for example, it's important for children, or it's part of the law that children have to apply for a national ID card when they turn 18, where both parents' names are required. Furthermore, as children grew up, they realized that they also needed their father's names for marriage and inheritance. Through in-depth interviews with youth in their programs, SURF found that disclosure of birth history is necessary for the child's development. Prior to disclosure, young people often lacked agency or coping strategies to deal with their circumstances. Once the truth has been disclosed, there was an immediate negative response, but this evolved with time. However, all those interviewed said they valued knowing the truth. Despite the challenges disclosure brings, it resolves feelings of uncertainty regarding identity. These youth also felt that they now had the ability to make sense of their experiences and connect with others in similar situations. Next slide, please. So moving forward, I want to highlight two main areas of focus. One, identity and national registration for youth, and two, psychological support. The first recommendation here is to make it easy for children to be registered. Beyond national ID cards, this also applies, as I said, to inheritance and marriage. It also applies to education. Young people are asked for the names of their parents when they're applying for a national exam. If the father is not known, they're not allowed to register. So most of them end up going to talk to their mothers. And this process of forced disclosure can be traumatizing, both for the mother and for the children. So making it easier for young people to register is therefore paramount. Second is to put in place programs that provide psychological support for these people and their mothers. Most of the time, the focus is on economic empowerment, but economic empowerment without mental health does not work. The work Samuel undertakes adds an essential layer to the literature on conflict-related sexual violence. While the initial focus of SURF and Foundation Rwanda was access to resources and services, the addition of psychological support to mothers and children is perhaps their most important contribution. The provision of safe spaces and counseling for mothers allows them to come to terms with the impact of trauma, not only on themselves, but on their relationships with children. As interviews suggest, for some mothers, the support groups were the first time they felt comfortable talking about their experiences. For children, the support groups provided them with the opportunity to discuss coping strategies and identity. So at the end of the day, disclosure can create disruption, but support groups seem to be a meaningful avenue to address related emotions and reduce intergenerational trauma. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dipali. Our next speaker I would like to invite is Tatiana Taksiva. She's going to be speaking on her work with children born of sexual violence and war in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Dr. Taksiva, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to take part in this important discussion today. So between 1991 and 1995, Bosnia was one of the deadliest regions in the wars triggered by the disintegration of the Socialist Republic of Yugoslavia. Under the banner of the old Yugoslav army, all sides, but particularly Serbian nationalist forces, engaged in campaigns of ethnic cleansing of Bosnians of Muslim faith and heritage. A significant strategy for achieving this harm was the rape and impregnation of women of the enemy group. It is estimated that between 25,000 and 40,000 Bosniak women and girls, the greatest number, were victims of genocidal rape and enforced impregnation. Children born as a result of war rape belong to a demographic referred to as a hidden population, whose members often intentionally hide their membership because such knowledge within their community and broader social group frequently results in stigmatization and discrimination. Research shows that even decades after the conflict, they can still be seen as children of the enemy and children of shame, with local and international actors contesting their ethnic identity, their citizenship rights, and rights to education, family identity, and even physical security. I've been working with this population in the Bosnian Federation for over 12 years now. My close work with 3 such young individuals in particular, 2 women and 1 man from Bosnia, who are now members of the Sarajevo-based association, the Forgotten Children of War, strives to show how they see themselves and how they would like to be seen by others. These young people show that their victimization is neither absolute nor frozen in time, and demonstrate understanding of the strategic importance of the labels victim and survivor. Being seen as a victim is important in the context of their fight for legal and civic recognition. At the same time, in many different contexts and situations, they see themselves as survivors. For researchers and policymakers, taking their lead in terms of self-representation is of key significance. Since I began my work with these young people, I have had the privilege of observing their gradually increasing willingness to tell their stories in public in different ways, through reconciliation and transitional justice workshops held at various fora on the territories of the former Yugoslavia and beyond, but also through art exhibitions and art performances. These 3 individuals in particular have all embraced activism as a form of constructive engagement with their individual, social, and political realities, and through this, they have inspired others. The images that you see on my slides are taken from the 2019 stage play called In the Name of the Father, a documentary dramatic performance based on the children's stories and experiences. Many of the performers are the children themselves. They also recently led an art exhibit entitled Breaking Free, Speaking Out, which draws inspiration from the stories of the mothers and the children born of rape. These events have been healing for both the children and for the members of the public, as they actively contribute to the reconciliation agenda in Bosnia and more broadly in the region. The public visibility these events have afforded, in conjunction with research and strong advocacy of the children themselves and their allies, have also contributed since last year to their landmark legal recognition as civilian victims of war alongside their mothers in the Bosnian Federation. In developing discourses of research and policy, there is a risk of confining the experiences of children born of sexual exploitation and war rape to ostracism and marginalization. In my work, I've strived to show how feminist approaches to knowledge creation, especially through case studies, provide alternative and more nuanced ways to understand individual ways of knowing, agency, and self-representation. At the level of the group of children born of war rape, it remains important to continue to bring light to their distinctive social, cultural, and political vulnerability, and the egregious violations of their civic, national, and legal identities. At the same time, however, I hope that researchers, policymakers, and practitioners acknowledge the importance of insights gained from the specificity of particular individual lives within their distinctive social contexts and what they can reveal about resilience, authenticity, as well as social transformation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Tatiana Sanchez-Para. She will be talking with us about the situation in Colombia. She is with the School of Social and Political Science at the University of Edinburgh. Dr. Sanchez-Para, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the invitation to talk about the experience of the Colombian case, of course, to the speakers and to everyone who has joined us today. To begin, I'd like to highlight three key aspects of the context. So first, Colombia has experienced an ongoing armed conflict for over 60 years. To give you an idea of the scale, with a population of around 50 million people, the country has more than 9 million officially recognized victims of the armed conflict. Secondly, during the conflict, all legal and illegal armed groups have perpetrated sexual violence against the population. To this date, there are more than 38,000 people officially recognized as victims, most of them Afro-Colombian, indigenous, and rural mestiza cisgender women and girls. And of course, as a result of this, many cisgender women and also some transgender men have become pregnant. Due to different circumstances that often involve lack of access to safe, free, and destigmatized abortion services, they have given birth to their children. And lastly, Colombia has a robust and gender-sensitive transitional justice system, including a domestic reparation program, which is where I would like to focus today. Next slide, please. In 2011, Colombia introduced the Victims and Land Restitution Law, which established the legal framework for the country's domestic reparation program. This legislation made Colombia the first country to recognize children born of conflict-related sexual violence as direct victims of the armed conflict. Although this recognition entitles them to integral reparations, including rehabilitation, satisfaction, compensation, and guarantees of non-repetition, 10 years after the program's implementation, little progress has been made in terms of granting them the right to redress. Information about them within the reparation system is scarce and very often contradictory. For example, some official reports refer to figures of around 900 children officially recognized as victims, whether other reports refer to around 800 for the same period. In terms of actual reparations, there are references to only 63 people having received financial compensation, and to this date, I have not found any records of any other measures of reparations having been delivered in almost 10 years. Now, despite this lack of developments, there are lessons that can be learned from this experience. And I would like to share two. Next slide, please. First, with the Colombian domestic reparation program, what we have witnessed is attempts to create a bureaucratic system of reparations in which the category of children born of conflict-related sexual violence could exist. So after many negotiations, it was agreed that the priority, of course, was to respect women's processes and avoid re-victimizing them by forcing the disclosure of their experiences to their children when they were not ready to do so. However, this decision came with no strategies to, for instance, offer specialized and sustained psychosocial, emotional, and even spiritual support to the women when it came with the disclosure, but also to parenting. At the same time, women, regardless of the stage where they were in their healing process or the economic hardship they may be enduring, are not only expected to raise and love their children, but also to navigate the convoluted victimhood system to seek justice for themselves and their sons and daughters. So far, the category of children born of conflict-related sexual violence became lost within the measures, standards, instruments that were created to address sexual violence. For instance, the few cases who have received economic compensation have been approached as direct victims of sexual violence. Now, lastly, when it has to do with reparations and justice, we are going to continue struggling to understand what justice and redress means for people born of conflict-related sexual violence if we continue to only see them as their parents' children. Access to reparations for survivors of sexual violence has so far not been straightforward, and the process in the Colombian case is often described by them as re-victimizing due to the fragmented nature of its delivery and also the highly bureaucratized system that they have to navigate. This, of course, needs to change, but the experience of people born of conflict-related sexual violence are not the same as those of their parents, despite being closely entangled. For people who lived in militarized context of colonial and economic violence, like many of these young people born of conflict-related sexual violence, to dream of a future is a privilege. Redress, in their cases, must not only account for the victimizing events of the past, but should lay the foundations for them to dream of a future that belongs to them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sanchez-Para. I'd like to invite our next speakers, Virginie Ladisch and Jacqueline Mutere. Virginie is with the International Center for Transitional Justice, and Jacqueline is the founder and director of Grace Agenda. Ladies, the floor is yours.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Diane, and to all your colleagues at the Fletcher School and Tufts for making this event and, more importantly, this book possible. Jackie and I met to discuss the challenges facing children born of conflict-related sexual violence back in 2018, which is what led us to write the chapter for this edited volume. And now, being invited to this webinar 5 years later, it's interesting to reconnect and take stock on how the conversation has evolved on this topic, what progress has been made, and also to note some persistent challenges both at the policy level and on the ground. So when we wrote our chapter, the big news at the time was the recent adoption of Security Council Resolution 2467, which for the first time specifically named children born as a result of conflict-related sexual violence. And this was really significant. It was the first time that they were acknowledged as rights holders that suffer both from the direct and indirect harms committed against their parents. And now since then, it's good to see, and many of these efforts were already mentioned by Kimberly and Diane, so I won't spend too much more time on it, but it's good to see that things have been continuing to evolve with the Secretary General's thematic report in 2022, and followed by this establishment of international call to action and platform to ensure the rights and well-being of children born of conflict-related sexual violence. And I think you can see on this chart from that platform is something that resonates really with the work that ICDJ did in Uganda. When we first undertook research to look at what the situation was facing formerly abducted young mothers and their children, what we found is that, as Kimberly mentioned briefly, this idea of stigma doesn't fully capture the breadth of challenges and experiences. And I think stigma can maybe seem a bit lighter than what the reality is. And actually, I think it's important to unpack the different levels of rejection that some of these children face, first with the complicated relationship with their mother. Then, if they're accepted by their mother, the risk of rejection by their family. And then another important layer that's maybe not often given enough attention is the community rejection. And here we sometimes see that there's sort of one-way sensitization projects where there's an effort to tell the community, you need to accept these children, it's not their fault. But that one-way sensitization hasn't proven to be effective, because what we found is that if there's not a space to also take care of the needs of those community members whose rights were also violated during a period of conflict, there's a natural tendency to kind of find someone to blame for the suffering that we have. And oftentimes it's those most vulnerable who will face that blame. Then there's also the level of government rejection, which several people have already talked about, in terms of the lack of papers and registration and the obstacles that poses to citizenship on so many levels. And linked to that is, back to the point of blame, is that what we also have found from a perspective of transitional justice is that if there's not an acknowledgement and a taking of responsibility for the harms that took place during a period of conflict, oftentimes in that void of responsibility, again, people will fill the gaps with their own narratives and again, turn the blame on those most vulnerable. So I think these intersections of different factors and different challenges highlight that we really need to have a multi-pronged approach and long-term approach. But now that's the big picture. I want to turn it over to Jackie for her thoughts. Next slide, please, and to Jackie.
Thank you. No. Go back a little bit, please. I just want to highlight something on the previous slide. Thank you. I just wanted to highlight specifically the advocacy by, with, and for the children born of conflict sexual violence. And before I do that, I just want to thank the university for allowing me to participate in this, because as I think I bring the voice of, I don't know if to call it reason, or maybe to a bit of more grounding, because as a survivor, my perspective would not really be very different, but would just be a bit more strengthened, and just affirm really what all the researchers and all the partners and comrades have written out. But mine was really just to speak specifically about the advocacy by, with, and for the children born of sexual violence, in terms of reparations, and considering them specifically also as survivors of the sexual violence. It's a unique perspective as we're speaking right now. What it used to, as Virginie has so well articulated, these children from the age of 0, that was in 2008, and I'm speaking specifically about Kenya, are now 15 years old. The dynamics are definitely very, very different. And what the advocacy strategy was for at that time is very different from what it is right this time, because there's the issue of disclosure to the children by the parents, and this brings a lot of a conflict within the families, and it brings a lot of dynamics within the families. And so this has brought on a very different perspective on how children should be approached. And now the children are no more, but now how teens should be approached. And so advocacy with these children is perspective. So it's an ongoing thing. Specifically when it comes also to meaningful engagement with the survivors, it has to be both with the children and with the survivors specifically, because now you cannot consider them, you consider them as a whole, but consider each of them also as a unit, because the needs are very, very different. The trauma of one does not translate into the trauma of another. And so the mental health key component is a critical component in outlining all these issues, because the trauma experienced by a child in a certain area, because of the different dynamics in that area, will be different trauma experienced within a child in another area, and also by the mothers. And so in any initiative, a key component must be the mental health. And we consider them now, in the evolving conversation, we consider them now as rights holders. We consider them survivors by extension. We consider them survivors as a cause, and we consider them survivors as a result. And so the approach is this: that what is good for the goose is good for the gander. And any approach that is good, that is done for the parent, should be done also for the child. Finally, it's my call to action. And my call to action is that I call on all who are present here today to make these findings and submissions a living document, to make it a reality, to make it meaningful participation in the reparation processes for all children born to victims and survivors, whose rights are also enshrined in the Universal Declaration. Next slide, please. This was recited by the children. It was actually devolved. It actually evolved from the children, not devolved from the children, devolved from the parents to the children. And it talks about a tree. And it talks about the children that are surrounded by many others just like me. They started as seeds. They were just planted differently, but they're just as beautiful as the others you see. And the plea was for our Kenyans, because it was directed at the survivors in Kenya to help me and my mother to forget the pain, to stop the pointing finger, which speaks of the stigma, and it asks them to help me live again. So pour faith and love in my soil, that I might live again and that I might sing again. And that is really the concept of reparations for sexual violence and reparations for the children. And the children end up by saying, naipenda Kenya yetu, na wewe je, I love my country Kenya, what about you? That speaks to them about the ownership that they still belong to. They have a feeling of belonging still in their country, that despite their circumstances, they still belong. And they ask that. And so finally, my words is to this, that to utilize the information that is shared here, to breathe life into global interventions, that the submissions that are made here may not be viewed as merely as an academic exercise, because everybody is speaking as an academic, as a researcher. I speak as a survivor, but that these children, like seeds, they will grow and become trees, that they will give back to the world exactly what they give, what they get. And I beg that we give them light. Let us be the light. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Virginie and Jacqueline, for that very powerful intervention. I would now like to turn the floor over to Dr. Sima Samar. She is the former director of the Afghan Independent Human Rights Commission. She's a visiting scholar with us, with Professor Tyden and I, and Dipali at the Fletcher School, and asking her to reflect on what she's heard and also reflect based on the situation in Afghanistan. Dr. Samar, the floor is yours.
Yeah. First of all, thank you very much for including me in this program. And I have to say that I really impressed by the presentation of all the speakers. And thank you so much for raising these issues. Well, I think one of the common issue that we see on all the cases in Bosnia and Rwanda and in Colombia and also in Africa is the stigmatization of the victim or survivor, because that is putting them in a isolation situation and isolate them from the society, and nobody is trying to talk. And I'm glad that it's in recent years that the people are talking about these issues. And then as we see that the sexual violence or sexual gender-based violence during the conflict still not as criminalized as it should be, although it is, at least in the last 20 years or so, they're talking, after Bosnia actually, they're talking more about it, but it is still not enough that we all, as an activist, as a researchers, we have to raise this issue and talk about those issues in order to promote accountability and justice on sexual gender-based violence. The second point that I saw is that there are some very good positive action taken by the survivor or by the activists in different parts of the world, including in Bosnia, the woman who established this, was it Bosnia or the other, Rwanda, they established this network among themselves in order to support each other. And that is also really important, because they can see and come together and share their pain and see that they are not alone. They are other people, and they have to advocate for their for accountability and for justice, and also for reparation and psychosocial economical support for these victims. The third point, I think, which is really important, we need, all of us, we need to work more on it, is the recognition or acknowledgement by the United Nations, which is with the resolution. But honestly, that resolution, if we don't work a lot about that 2467 resolution by the Security Council or by the United Nations, then it stay as the resolution. We need to lobby and raise a lot of awareness among the different countries, in different conflict countries, that people should refrain from this war crimes or crimes against humanity. And it's such a heinous and most inhuman kind of a violence during the conflict when they commit this issue. The other point I think that I heard from our colleague, and I would say that loudly we have to, all of us to have to work on it, is that we actually have to raise this issue and push for acknowledgement, because there's a denial on this issue in most of the countries. Still, it's a lot of denial. I mean, it's even when they, in some of the countries, when they come up, maybe that the number of women who were victims of sexual gender-based violence or rape during the conflict, but they still don't have that that bravery or that confidence to come up, because they have to because of the stigmatization, because of the isolation, because of the different culture. For example, in Muslim countries, they keep saying that these children are illegal children. I mean, no human can be illegal in any terms. So that really requires a lot of lobby, and it's really important. Once we acknowledge the suffering of the mother and the child, then there's the policies that we could push the government for, social psychological support, reparation, economical support, educational support for the children who born out of this crime. I think these are common in most of all of the countries, including in Afghanistan or any other conflict countries. But coming back to Afghanistan, I think in country like Afghanistan or any other Muslim countries or poor countries where there's a big gap between the men and women in a patriarchal society, the mother and the child, both of them are really facing a lot of problem. The mother in our society, in some part of the society, the girl or a woman who has been raped by someone, it's always, most of the time, they are killed by the family member, by the male member of the family, in order to keep the honor of the family. They think that it's her mistake. She is victim and then victimized again and try to hide and deny the fact. The second point, I think that which is less in some of the families or in some communities, they try to commit an unsafe abortion in order to get rid of the child. And that also increase the risk of the life of the woman. I mean, she will lose the life, and of course the baby will be also aborted or killed, whatever they call it. And most of the time it is done after the third semester or second semester when the baby is bigger. And that is also something that increase a lot of risk for women. The third issue, I think, in some of the cases, these women who are victim of rape, then nobody in the society will accept them, and everybody is... and she is forced to marry a person who is addicted or with disability in order to get rid of the shame from the family, or in order to, as they say, to keep the honor of the family. I keep saying that there's no honor in the killing of a woman to keep for the family. So I think that is also something that lifetime problem, I think. The other point, I think, which is really a big issue for the children, because they are not given ID, because usually ID cards should be given under the name of the father. And then that child in the community is really facing a lot of harassment. They cannot go to school because everybody would say it's illegal, it's haram, and that is really something that put the child in a position. Usually the boys turn to be violent. They go to these criminal groups in order to take revenge, or to join to this extremist group, terrorist groups, and participate on smuggling of issues. The girls are forced to forced marriages, and they become servant within the family. Even if they are forced marriage, they they are not respected fully with honor and dignity within that family. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Samar. Really appreciate your comments from Afghanistan and from your perspective as an expert on sexual and gender-based violence. I'd like to invite our last speaker, Letitia Anderson, from the Office of the UN Special Representative of the Secretary General on Sexual Violence and Conflict. Letitia, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Diane, and thanks also for your visionary and pioneering work in this field, and to all of the researchers today for the very rich and insightful research. And to Tufts, of course, for the opportunity to share some reflections from the perspective of our office. So I will just provide a snapshot of some of our advocacy engagements and policy recommendations in this area, and some of the different approaches and debates across the UN system. So I'll also share some of the findings, from our special report, and how we can take forward what we've heard today for enhanced operational impact. So here at the UN in New York, we've just concluded Women, Peace and Security Week, which affirmed that peace, security, gender, sexuality and reproduction are no longer separate conversations, as indeed they never were for women. And our office has played a role in raising awareness of the plight and rights of children born of sexual violence since its inception as well. And back in 2007, I led the campaign for elevating sexual violence onto the Security Council's agenda as a way to bring all political, diplomatic and enforcement tools to bear on a scourge that had been called history's greatest silence and the world's least condemned crime of war. And that was the same year that Charlie Carpenter's seminal volume on children born of war was published. And we were mindful of that as a global protection gap, which she framed as one of the great understudied problems of our time. So indeed, across time and space, we have seen wars fought on and over the bodies of women and girls, with forced impregnation being integral to the military logic of mass rape, deployed for demographic and reproductive advantage by parties, including states, non-state actors, violent extremists and terrorist groups, with, of course, corrosive effects on social cohesion, shredding the social fabric by turning victims into outcasts. And historically, the aim has been to alter the ethnic composition of contested territory as a vehicle of genocide or ethnic cleansing, as seen in Rwanda, the former Yugoslavia, Myanmar, and elsewhere, to literally change the DNA of a disputed region and give rise to a generation of children that can be raised in a group's own image according to their ideology, and to swell the ranks of future recruits. And a notorious example is obviously Daesh's so-called cubs of the caliphate, born of rape and sexual slavery in Syria and Iraq. So in Rwanda, the UN has estimated that between 2,000 and 5,000 pregnancies resulted from sexual violence during the genocide. Yet incredibly, the issue was not raised at all during the Security Council deliberations on Rwanda in 1994. In Bosnia and Herzegovina, of course, women were held in rape camps and only released when it was no longer safe or possible to terminate the pregnancy. And yet, also incredibly, the Dayton peace agreements were silent on this issue. An estimated 8,000 children were born of sexual violence during the conflict in northern Uganda, and many of them born to survivors who were children themselves. During the civil war in Sierra Leone, an estimated 20,000 children were born of rape, and there are untold numbers in the DRC, South Sudan, Timor-Leste, Nigeria, and elsewhere. So part of the military logic I'm talking about is also the patriarchal logic that communities associate these children with their fathers, that bloodlines are perceived as patrilineal, and that women can be used as reproductive vessels, as if the womb can be turned into a kind of weapons factory for producing future generations of fighters. Harmful social norms related to honor, shame, and victim blame really drive the forced displacement of affected women and girls out of their communities, as we just heard from Sima in the context of Afghanistan. And so in the face of ostracism, reprisals, and accusations of collaboration with the enemy, many individuals will seek anonymity. And whether or not the conception was part of a systematic plan, these children are often viewed as children of the enemy. They're denied citizenship rights, identity documents, access to education, social services, healthcare, including immunization, and barred from ethnic and cultural belonging, legal and inheritance rights. So our mandate works to continually expand the scope of recognition, protection, and rights in order to leave no one behind, and to provide a platform that bridges some of these unheard voices to the global diplomatic and donor community. In 2008, we organized a meeting on children born of sexual violence in conflict zones that featured Evelyn Amoni, who was a former forced wife of Joseph Kony, who raised children in the context of LRA captivity. And we also brought Mr. Alan Muhik from Bosnia to the United Nations headquarters to amplify his experience as a child born of sexual violence during the conflict, who is now father himself and grappling with complex questions around identity. We've also raised this issue directly with governments in the context of signing framework agreements, like the joint communique we signed in 2016 with Iraq or in 2020 with the government of Sudan. And in addition to reflecting this issue in our annual reports to the Security Council since 2009, we also published a special report on women and girls who become pregnant as a result of sexual violence and the children born of such violence, mandated by Resolution 2467, which has been mentioned today. And that report really highlighted the physical and psychological trauma, socioeconomic marginalization, risks of statelessness, discrimination, stigma, and legal barriers that impair the realization of human rights and correlate with the outbreak or escalation of conflict. And this report spanned 24 conflict settings since the 1990s and examined it as both a human right and a security issue. So deprived of other options for education, training, or social status, these children can be particularly susceptible to exploitation, trafficking, abduction, recruitment into armed groups, street gangs, or criminal networks, radicalization, and indoctrination. And at the same time, such assumptions or perceptions can become self-fulfilling prophecies. So we need to also counter harmful narratives that position children born of war as inherently bad blood or as internal enemies. We recorded the different ways children born of war are maligned through prejudicial naming practices, which has been mentioned this morning, and the way they may be viewed not merely as illegitimate or reminders of individual trauma and national humiliation, but also as future threats. And we found that after enduring the horrors of sexual slavery, many women face an impossible choice, whether to remain with their children in displacement camps or whether to hand their children over to orphanages and shelters in order to be able to return to their communities, as seen with the Iraqi Yazidi women or with the women and girls abducted by Boko Haram or Al-Shabaab, or girl mothers returning from LRA enclaves. The community rejection of the children also negates efforts to reintegrate and return their mothers. With respect to service provision, we saw two critical points. Firstly, that there's a difference between rights and needs. So all children, regardless of the circumstances of their conception, have the same universal rights under the Convention on the Rights of the Child, but nonetheless, children born of conflict-related rape may have additional needs and require additional support in order to be able to equitably access their rights to services and redress. And the second point is really how the fate and welfare of survivors and their children are inextricably linked, with the status and support given to the survivor being among the most relevant factors in children being able to realize their rights. So in terms of the way forward, I would just note that while we have had heightened advocacy, there are still massive programmatic gaps. We've reached a new level of consciousness, but not necessarily consensus in the treatment of these issues. So there are still ethical dilemmas across the UN system that view the issue through different lenses, whether humanitarian, human rights, or security, with some actors emphasizing that the risk of constructing children born of war as a category can actually reify stigma and break protective silences. But as others note, there are trade-offs in terms of human rights, because silence obviously shields the perpetrators and perpetuates sexual violence as a system of silencing and oppression and denies the survivors an outlet. So we've talked a bit about transitional justice, and I would also just note that it's critical to go beyond paying lip service to the existence of this category of survivors and actually start paying reparations to the individuals. Many of the examples highlighted in our report, from the Rwandan Fund for Survivors of Genocide to the Iraqi Yazidi Survivors Law, stop short of actually providing benefits to children born of wartime rape. We're also working to catalyze changes in public perceptions with media representatives in conflict-affected countries to sort of socialize and disseminate the message that to be born of a crime is not a crime. And at the same time, we need to be vigilant that this agenda is not co-opted by other agendas who may seek to roll back or reverse women's sexual and reproductive health and rights. So we also need to affirm that the human sexual and reproductive rights of women and girls and survivors are non-negotiable, and that discrimination can never be justified on cultural, traditional, or religious or other grounds. And to that end, we also work with religious and traditional leaders to help to alleviate stigma and harmful social norms. So I'll just end by saying that for the UN, ultimately, as Jackie alluded to, the measure of success is really not more documents, data points, and discussions, but less war, less rape, and less stigma. And we really do need to look at the environmental factors, as Kimberly unpacked today, to understand what enables or increases the opportunities for these conflict-affected individuals to survive and thrive, and what are the constraints for them to realize their rights and transitional justice. And there's wide variation, as we've heard today, so we can learn from past stories of neglect and rejection, but also from stories of acceptance and support to find out what works to replace horror with healing and hope. And I do think stigma needs to be treated as a harm in its own right. We've certainly shifted the paradigm that says sexual violence is not an inevitable byproduct of war, but we still treat stigma as an inevitable byproduct of rape. But stigma, as we know, kills. There are lethal consequences to stigma, whether it's reprisals, extreme poverty, honor killings, suicide, untreated trauma, and disease. So I think really the price of progress is eternal vigilance and continually asking what rights or needs are neglected, and who is missing from the scope of protection. One of our recommendations in the special report was for more longitudinal studies to inform policy, programmatic, and peace-building responses. So we really commend Diane, Kimberly, Dipali, and others on the new publication, Challenging Conceptions, which really provides compelling qualitative analysis and research to help us also at the UN as practitioners take forward the idea to recognize survivors and children born of war not as passive victims, but as right holders, stakeholders, and pen holders of history. And Susan Brown-Miller wrote back in 1975, we need to give rape its history in order to deny it a future. And I think likewise, we have to learn from the long history of children born of war in order to give them the safe and equitable future they deserve. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Letitia. Well, we've had some questions come up in the chat, and I have seen that the panelists are answering those questions either to the whole group or individually reaching out to those who've asked the questions. We're nearly at time, so what I'd like to do is give a final thank you for this webinar and say that today welcomed our great panelists and also you as the audience to really add a deeper understanding to the latest thinking and action about children born of war-related sexual violence, their mothers and fathers, and their experiences, as we heard today, across their life cycles. Our book really has authors who are offering a really rich ethnographic and, as Letitia mentioned, longitudinal research. So in the book, you'll find chapters, and our authors are working with children throughout a whole range of their lives. And they're identifying the specific challenges and discrimination that many of these children experience, but at the same time paying attention to the factors that these children and their mothers and advocates are using to enhance their lives and their life chances. An email with a link to the recorded discussion is coming to everyone who registered. It'll take a day or two, but you'll receive that link, and you're most welcome, and we would encourage you to share with your networks. And finally, I want to express my deep gratitude to the panelists and the attendees, and thank you for your participation. Goodbye.